There is no more compelling story in the Old Testament than that of David, who rose from a simple shepherd boy to become the giant slayer, the poet laureate of Israel, and her greatest and most beloved king. The Old Testament devotes no less than 66 chapters to his story, more than to anyone else. And still today, the symbol of the Jewish faith is a six-pointed star, the Star of David. And there persisted among God's people a hope, an expectation across the centuries that one day Yahweh would anoint a King of Kings, a Mashiach, in Greek a Christos, and he would be called the Son of David. I'm Ken Durham. I teach in the Lipscomb University College of Bible and Ministry, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this new series of Bible studies we're calling David's Supporting Cast. We've invited 8 gifted students of the Bible, 8 women, to explore the wild and fascinating story of King David through the eyes of some of the main characters in his life, David's supporting cast. We think these studies will bless and challenge you to go deeper in your studies of the Word and will ultimately point you beyond a remarkable and very flawed person named David to the person we believe to be the true King of Kings, God's Messiah, Jesus the Lord. Today we're pleased to have Heather HODGES with us today. Heather's a fellow Texan, so there's a connection there. But Heather, thank you for being willing to join us in this enterprise. We think that these lessons can serve the purposes of a lot of different individuals and churches in the months and years ahead. So before you talk to us about Naomi and Boaz and that part of David's story, tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, certainly. I'm delighted. Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a mom and a wife. We have 2 boys, Caleb and Elijah. They're 13 and 15. My husband Wade and I have been in ministry for 20 years. We're currently serving a church in Dallas. And I'm also an artist. And that's my passion and my love.
What kind of art?
I'm an oil painter.
All right.
Yeah, and I love, I do worship painting. My favorite thing is to paint and preach, where I paint.
Simultaneously.
Well, not simultaneously.
Well.
I'll do one at a time.
Okay, fair enough.
I'll paint during worship, and then when it's time for the message, I will give a talk based on what I painted. But that's my passion, is integrating theology and the arts, because I believe the arts have so much to bring to the story and a new way of telling the story. And there's so many artists in our churches who aren't using their gifts yet. And I think theology and the arts have a really great relationship. And right now I'm working on my doctorate of ministry at Abilene Christian.
Good.
And so it's going to be focused on theology and the arts.
I have long thought that we have undervalued and underused the artistic gifts of so many of our folks in our churches and in our ministries. So I'm thankful you're out in front of that and showing us the possibilities. We wish we could set up an easel for you today, but we don't have that with us. But we do look forward very much now to your lesson on Naomi and a story of inclusion and embrace.
Have you ever been a stranger in a strange land? Have you ever experienced what it feels like to be the outsider, to be the only one who looks like you or sounds like you? Have you ever been the new kid sitting alone in the lunchroom? And do you know what it feels like to have that one person include you and make you feel welcome? When I was 4 years old, my family moved to Isfahan, Iran. And we were the only Americans on our block. And I was the only blonde child that most Iranians had ever seen at that time. And I can still remember how my cheeks burned from where the Iranian women would pinch me because I was blonde and blue-eyed with fair skin and freckles. I really stood out. My whole family stood out. We were the foreigners. We were the strangers in a strange land. But there was an Iranian family down the street who welcomed us and included us. Our family was their family. And I can't even tell you how many brothers and sisters there were in that family. There were so many that we played with. And there was only one person in the whole family who spoke English, and that was the oldest son. And he was away at school most of the time. But my brothers and I were so little that we picked up Farsi really fast. And so we became the translators between our two families. But the language barrier didn't really matter that much, because it's easy to know when you're welcomed and loved and when you're not. I think we all know what it feels like to be excluded from the group. And hopefully we all know what it feels like to be included and welcomed. The story of Naomi and Ruth is a story of a stranger who is welcomed by the insider and becomes a vital part of the community. When we think of the book of Ruth, we often think of a beautiful love story, but it is so much more. It's an evocative, gritty, risky tale of courage and death, of redemption and steadfast love. It's a story of inclusion and embrace. And I think that this little story has so much more to say than meets the eye. But we have to be willing to look beyond the surface. The story begins when a woman called Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons leave home because of a famine, and they move far away to the country of Moab. But while they're there, Naomi's husband dies. So do their 2 sons, who had married Moabite girls. And so after this, Naomi, who's now a widow, decides to go back home because she's heard that the famine is over. And one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, commits to going with her. And so they travel back to Israel, back to the town of Bethlehem. But they are 2 destitute widows, and they have to get gutsy and creative just to survive. Now, there was a custom in the land at that time that would have Naomi's dead husband's family provide for them through a kinsman redeemer. And that's exactly what Boaz wanted to do. But only after Naomi forces his hand and sends Ruth to propose marriage to him. But there was a closer relative who was a kinsman redeemer ahead of Boaz. But that guy declined the opportunity. And so Boaz marries Ruth and redeems her and Naomi. And then Boaz and Ruth have a son, Obed, who becomes the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, the story of Naomi is not a Cinderella fairy tale where the hero gets the girl and they live happily ever after. We need to pause and back up and take another look at this story through the eyes of the sufferer and see what we can learn from Naomi's perspective. The first 5 verses of this story let us know just how much trouble she's in and just how desperate her situation has become. Let's back up and read these 5 verses through a patriarchal, cultural lens and see what we can understand and learn. Let's go to chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. The first thing that we run into in this story is there's a famine in the land. This is catastrophic. We've never experienced a famine in our land in our time. I mean, I may say I'm famished, but then I go to the fridge and get a snack. Here we're reading about a time when people were literally starving. Things were so bad that mom and dad pack up the kids and start walking in hopes of finding a better life somewhere else. They leave their Jewish homeland and head to Moab, an unclean land full of unclean people. You would have to be pretty desperate to move your family from the relative safety of home where you knew God lived to a foreign land that was hostile to your people and worshiped idols. And we can criticize Naomi and say, she shouldn't have left home. She shouldn't have left the land that God had promised to his people. But it wasn't her choice. It was her husband's choice. In patriarchal cultures, women don't make decisions. The man makes the decision. Their marriage wasn't a democratic relationship. Naomi followed her husband. In patriarchal cultures, a woman's value is determined by her relationship with men, her relationship to her father, to her husband, and most importantly, her relationship to her sons. You see, a woman's primary purpose in this culture to her family and to her community would have been to give birth to sons. There was a TED Talk recently by Malawa's father. That's the young woman from Pakistan that was shot by the Taliban for advocating education for girls. And he said, in patriarchal and tribal cultures, even today, a father is known by his sons, but he is proud to be known by his daughter. In this story, Naomi's family is running from death, only to run into it headlong. When they arrive in Moab, Naomi's husband dies. But she has double insurance. She has 2 sons. And then these 2 sons go and marry pagan girls, which is not exactly a Jewish mama's hopes and dreams for her boys. And we tend to dress this up a little. I've heard people say, well, Ruth was probably a Moabite princess. Probably not. She married a famine refugee. In this culture, a daughter would have been used to secure an alliance or to bring more prosperity to the family. So for her to marry a famine refugee, she was probably considered a throwaway girl by her family, maybe the 6th or 7th daughter. They were just happy for her to have somewhere to go. And then after 10 years of infertility, no grandchildren. And then the worst tragedy of all, both sons die. Naomi's family story has come to a dead end. No wonder her life seems hopeless, and she says, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter, because she feels that God has made her life bitter. When we read the book of Ruth and we read the book of Job, the similarities and the parallels are extraordinary. Old Testament scholars have pointed out that when we read the book of Ruth, we're really reading about a female Job. You see, because Naomi and Job both experience a complete and total loss. But I think Naomi out-Jobs Job because he's a man and he can start over. She's a woman and she can't start over. She's post-menopausal. It's over for her. There will be no more sons. She's in a foreign land. She has no one. She's old, and she's a woman. And this is just in the first 5 verses of the story. It's over before it begins. A lot of times we read a story and it has a tragic ending. Here we see a tragic beginning. But this is when the biblical storyteller zooms in and the real story begins. Because despite the name on the book, this story is not primarily about Ruth or even Naomi. This story is about the God of steadfast love. You see, this isn't any ordinary love story. It's a Hesed story. Hesed is a Hebrew word that doesn't quite translate to one single word in English, but it's the sense of compassionate loyalty, of merciful, steadfast, unbreakable, unyielding love. And it's usually translated as kindness or loyalty in English, but you can see that it means so much more. So let's take a look at 3 places in the story when Hesed, when steadfast love, is played out at the beginning and the middle and the end of the story. At the beginning of the story, we see Hesed between Naomi and Ruth. Let's look at chapter 1 again, starting in verse 6. Then Naomi started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house, and may the Lord deal kindly, may the Lord deal hesed with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of a new husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. Naomi blesses them and asks God to deal hesed with them, to bless them and be kind to them. And Orpah, the first daughter-in-law, obeys. She goes back home. But Ruth doesn't. And what we read next are some of the most profoundly moving words in the whole Bible. Let's look at verse 16. But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." That's Hesed. That is steadfast, unyielding love from Ruth to Naomi. And I've always wondered what could have instilled such profound love between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law, between a Moabite and an Israelite. And I can only conclude that it's God. Ruth experienced God's hesed through Naomi and through this refugee family that she married into. Now later, towards the middle of the story, after Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem and they're just working hard to find enough food to survive, Naomi sends Ruth into the barley fields to glean. And this is when we meet another character. We meet Boaz, who turns out to be one of those kinsman redeemers who is supposed to help the widows in the family. And Boaz is kind to Ruth, and he even gives her extra food to take back to Naomi. But he doesn't take much more initiative, and we don't hear anything else out of him until Naomi decides to take a big risk. And she sends Ruth to propose marriage to him in the middle of the night. You see, Naomi knows the rules of her culture, and so she knows how to break them. Let's look at chapter 3, starting in verse 6. So Ruth went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty, of your hesed, is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman." So here the story takes an interesting turn. Not only do the women force Boaz's hand, but he realizes just how kind Ruth is being to him. She is showing him hesed. The outsider, the immigrant, is showing the insider how to love and how to behave. Now let's jump to what I call the baby shower scene. And let's look at the end of chapter 4, starting in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse, the father of David. The centerpiece of this part of the story is not the mother, Ruth. It's the grandmother, Naomi. Most baby showers are focused on the mom. But here we have the women of the village coming to celebrate with the grandmother. You see, this story began with Naomi's loss, and it ends with Naomi's gain. It began with death, and it ends with birth, the birth of a son. But for whom? The women said, "Naomi has a son." Not Ruth, Naomi. But why? Because God is pouring out a double hesed on Naomi. She's no longer empty, she's full. God is showing her compassionate, merciful, faithful, steadfast love. First, by giving her Ruth, who is more precious than 7 sons. And then second, by giving her Obed, a grandchild who will secure the future of her family. Now, the first lesson we learn from the story of Naomi is that God has a crucial role for women to play in the kingdom. In our story, Naomi and Ruth play a leading part in the mission of God through their courage, through their trust, through their commitment to each other, through their hesed, through their steadfast love to each other and to God. They become nation builders. They become the great-grandmothers of King David. And they are teaching us and showing us how to be courageous and gutsy risk takers for God. You see, it's not okay for me or any of my sisters to sit on the sidelines while our brothers build the kingdom. We need all hands on deck. God intends for us to work side by side, using our specific gifts and our specific talents to the glory of God and the beauty of the church. God is doing great things through his daughters, and I believe with all my heart that our Heavenly Father wants to be known by his daughters as well as his sons. We both have a job to do. The second lesson from the story of Naomi is that inclusion and embrace are open to everyone. Ruth was a Moabite. She was an outsider. Israel and Moab were enemies. And the biblical writer doesn't want us to forget that. Again and again, it says not just Ruth, but Ruth the Moabite. Even when she marries Boaz, it says Ruth the Moabite. And even though she was an outsider, an immigrant, she became incorporated into the life of the community as a full-fledged member, a valuable member. God used the outsider to not only bless Naomi, but the nation of Israel. And the third lesson that we learn from this story is that God does his best work even in the bleakest circumstances, especially through the courageous and steadfast sacrificial actions of people like Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. How many immigrants and refugees and outsiders are scanning the horizon right now in search of just a sliver of hope, and like Naomi, finding none? And would they believe us if we told them this story and to try to show them that God works through hopeless situations? Maybe. But only if, in addition to telling them this story, we had the courage to live it out, to put God's hesed on display by loving the outsider as God has loved us. Because when we love the outsider, we not only put flesh on an ancient love story, we also discover the good news in this story afresh for ourselves. When we make room for the outsider, we're making room for God. Room for God to work not only in their lives, but also in ours.
Wow, Heather, you have reminded us yet again of what a very human story our Bible is. Mm-hmm. And I just want to thank you for several elements of this portrait. But then you're a painter, so that's what you're gifted to do. So we've got Ruth, the throwaway girl, mm-hmm. and we've got Naomi, who out-Jobed Job. Mm-hmm. And here are these two desperate women as the story first unfolds. And I just wonder, how do we use this picture, which Scripture clearly invites us into, mm-hmm. to have a heart for people in our time? I mean, I can't turn on the evening news, which I continue to do, even though it depresses the fool out of me, without seeing the latest story on refugees and immigrants and disadvantaged and dispossessed people. That's who Naomi and Ruth mm-hmm. were, right? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But this is the family of Jesus we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So how do you connect this story to some of the immediate history that we find ourselves in?
Absolutely. And the real question there is, are the stories in the Bible relevant to us today? Yes. We're seeing this gritty, authentic, raw story that was relevant 2,800 years ago, that's still relevant today. We're still dealing and managing and navigating through a lot of these same issues. And one of the questions that I was pondering while I was working on this talk was, why on earth is this story in the Bible? Why do we have this story here? And I think there's a part of the answer to that question is we need a royal birth story for King David. Yeah. There's that. Mm-hmm. But then, as you pointed out, we have these two women, Naomi and Ruth, who both get to play an outsider, an immigrant, a refugee at different times in the story. And we see that in the story of King David, in the story of Jesus. We have this outsider, this immigrant who is grafted in, this person from Moab who was unclean, probably worshipped idols, but came to know God and came to know God's hesed, God's love, mm-hmm. through Naomi and through the family of Israel. And so I think that is one of the things that we have to remember in our time right now. There's no others. There's us. There's
us. Yeah. And as you said, we're invited into the story of Jesus here. You know, this points ahead, the Redeemer language, Boaz, that concept that comes to have its glorious fullness in Jesus. You know, we begin to awaken to our need to be redeemed in our own loss, in our own devastation. And so there's so much here that looks ahead, doesn't it, to Jesus. And I think about how in Matthew, when Matthew sets out his genealogy of Jesus, he puts all these women's names in there.
Suspect women, too.
Yes, women of suspect reputation.
Shady characters in there.
You got Rahab and folks like that. But, you know, in the material of the ancient Near East, you know, the story is always told through the lives of men. And so it's like Matthew went out of his way to remind us of these gutsy, Hesed-driven women that gave us Jesus. And I love the way you brought that out and helped us make that connection. So, exclusion and embrace? No, inclusion.
And embrace.
Exclusion and Embrace, that's a great book title by Miroslav Volf.
Yes, it
But
is.
thank you for putting a spin on that.
You bet.
And so how do you see those two things at work together in the gospel elements that are in this story of Naomi and Ruth?
They're everywhere. It's woven throughout the story that those that we think are supposed to be excluded, the unclean, the ungodly, are actually included and embraced. And that is, and I think that's what we're called to do today, that we are called as Christ followers to include and embrace the outsider, whether that's an immigrant or a refugee or somebody who's marginalized in our community. We are called to include them, to touch them, and embrace them and pull them in and bring them in.
Yeah, and not as an act of charity, although charity is a gift of God, but as an act of identity and community.
Absolutely.
This is who we are. This is our greater family of humanity and faith. And I just find this story so stirring in that reminder. So if you were to pick one quality in Naomi that we do not long reflect on, she's sort of a player in the Ruth story, but you have put the spotlight on her. What do you admire most in Naomi?
I love that she's a risk taker.
Yeah.
She doesn't just sit back and wait for things to happen. She takes initiative and she goes after it. And we get this sense of Naomi and Ruth both that they aren't just wallflowers, that they are courageous, they're gutsy, and that they're risk takers for their family, for their survival, and also for God. I love that.
Yeah, I think that whole story of getting Boaz, bringing him into the story, that's pretty gutsy stuff, pretty clever, and we're asked to admire that, and rightly so, especially as we see that these women were part of God's work of Hesed.
That's right.
Thank you for bringing that word into the story and reminding us that the grace of God can be glimpsed from afar off in the Old Testament. It's not just something we learn of when we turn to the pages of the New Testament, but that same God has been working through men and women, especially in this story of courage and faith and grit and faithfulness. Thank you, Heather, for what you brought to us today.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.